Hello everyone, my name is John Sierra, and I am a Tolkien scholar, and I am here to answer all of your questions about the works of J.R.R. Tolkien, whether it be The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, or really whatever, or just questions about Tolkien in general. And of course, every week I will be taking all of the questions that I think are the best and answering them in a video such as this. So these are all from the past week. If you take a look at the link in the description, there is a link to my Quora account. Of course, you could always leave me a comment, and you can ask any question you'd like in a comment, and I will do my best to answer it there. But if you want your question featured in a video, go to Quora, ask it there. It's very, very easy to make an account. You could even use an existing Google or Facebook account. And then just tag me in it. Like I said, there's a link to my Quora in there, and even if you don't have that link, it'll suggest people to tag, and I'll probably be near the top of that list. So anyway, we have 18 questions to get to this week, so let's get to them. Okay, first question. This one was asked by John Thompson, and he asked, how does the light of the sun reach Valinor after the change of the world? So, of course, Valinor is a kingdom, and it was located in the continent of Aman, or I should say it is located in what used to be the continent of Aman, which was to the west of Middle-earth. We know it as the uttermost west, the westernmost part of Arda. It is west with a capital W, because, of course, there was the Akalabeth that happened. The world was flat, and then the Akalabeth happened, and it got reshaped into a sphere. And when that happened, Aman, the entire continent, including Valinor, was removed from the planet. So it still is nearby, though. It's still nearby. Aman is close enough that the elves and the Maya can sail there. It is the uttermost west. So while it's not part of Arda, it is connected to it, but by what the elves call the straight road. It's close enough to be a journey that can be done by ship. So with this in mind, the light of the sun would reach there just like it reaches Middle-earth. Okay, next question. This one is anonymous. Why didn't the Ring of Power try to get lost by Gollum and found by an orc? Well, the One Ring did do exactly that. That is exactly what happened. By slipping away from Gollum while he was hunting for food, Gollum didn't notice that the ring was gone. He was a little bit preoccupied with his meal. The One Ring was absolutely trying to be found by an orc. However, Bilbo found the ring instead. So this is something that was obviously unforeseen, and it wound up starting a chain of events that would eventually lead to the ring being destroyed. But the intention was be found by an orc. That was absolutely what the ring was trying to do. Okay, next question. This one is also anonymous, and this person asks, what is Tengwar Elvish? Is it used in any real-world languages? Tengwar is also called the Feanorian letters, and it's a mode of writing. A script, if you will. Now, what makes Tengwar so attractive is its implementation. It represented pretty much any mouth sound that you can think of, and you could write in any language in Tengwar. You could write Tengwar to represent Quenya. You could write Tengwar to represent Sindarin. You could write Tengwar to represent Telerin. You could write Tengwar to represent Westron, or any other language you could think of. Even Sauron used Tengwar. He had a constructed language called the Black Speech of Mordor. And the Black Speech of Mordor did not have a written mode. There was no alphabet. There was no writing. It was only an oral language. So when he went to put writing on the One Ring, the language that he used was the Black Speech, but the script he used was Tengwar. And it's a very fleshed out alphabet that you could use to represent a vast variety of mouth sounds. And you could use it to represent any real world language you wish. English, Russian, Klingon, whatever. And I'm going to show you something here. Oh, there it is. There's a bit of Tengwar that I came up with. And believe it or not, this is English. It's just written in Tengwar. And it says, I am the great Cornholio. I need teepee for my bunghole. Of course, the greatest use of the language yet, right? Couldn't possibly be surpassed. Anyway, thank you for the question. Okay, next question, and this one is also anonymous, and this person asks, who is Elrond's father, and how did Elrond's father know Celebrimbor? Elrond's father was named Earendil. He was often called Earendil the Mariner. You might remember in The Lord of the Rings, when everybody came to Rivendell, Bilbo wrote out a poem about Earendil, and read it out for everybody. Earendil was born a mortal because of his mixed heritage. He was born, his father Tuor was an Adan, which means he was of the Edain. He was a mortal man. And his mother was, of course, I believe her name was Idril. And Tuor later became immortal. He became an elf. He's the only mortal that ever happened to. That's not really related to this, but I wanted to mention, though, but when that happened, Tuor's son, Earendil, was already born. So he was born mortal. However, despite the fact that he was born mortal, him and his wife, Elwing, sailed west to Aman. And they did this specifically to pray to Manwe to intervene against Morgoth. Now, humans, mortals, were banned from doing this. It was actually under punishment of death that they could not go there. So, when Earendil and Elwing set out to do this, they were not hoping for mercy. They thought they were going to their deaths, that the Valar were going to kill them. They were going to be executed. But they thought at the very least they might hearken our prayer and intervene and save Middle-earth. Now, Manwe was feeling very lenient in this case. He had mercy on them because they both had elven ancestry. Of course, I mentioned Earendil, his mother was an elf, and Elwing, her mother was an elf, Nimloth, and she was also on her father's side. Her father was mortal, but that goes back to Luthien, and although, that was, Luthien became mortal, further back we have Melian, so there's even a little bit of Ainur ancestry in there as well. So that's why they were spared, because they did have elvish ancestry. They were at least part elf, but they were forced to make a choice. They had to choose whether they would be mortal or immortal. And their children, too, had to make this choice. Now, Earendil and Elwing both chose to be immortal, but they were forbidden to return to Middle-earth. Never again could they walk amongst the people there. There was a bit of an exception, because Earendil did return to Middle-earth to participate in the War of Wrath, where in his flying ship he defeated the dragon and Calagon, but then he returned to Aman, and I don't think he really walked among the people. I think he stayed in the ship the entire time. Now, Celebrimbor was the forger of the Elisar, and the Elisar, which means elfstone, was something that Earendil used to heal people, because that was a power that it had. And he carried it with him to Valinor. So that's how they sort of knew each other, because Earendil got the Elisar from Celebrimbor. Aragorn's stone is also called Elisar. It's either a replica also made by Celebrimbor, or it is the actual original stone, and it was brought back to Middle-earth by Gandalf, actually. There's two versions of the story, and, it's sort of like in-universe legends. You don't really know which one is actually true. Personally, I do think that it's the original stone and that it was brought back by Gandalf, because that version includes Gandalf giving the Elisar to Galadriel and stating a prophecy that she would give it to the man who would become king, which of course was Aragorn, who is a distant descendant of Tuor, Luthien, these characters that I'm mentioning. So it all leads to something. Good question, though. Okay. All right, next question. This one's also anonymous. In The Lord of the Rings, what happened to the Palantiri after Sauron was destroyed and Mordor crumbled as a kingdom? I should mention, by the way, that Sauron was not destroyed. He was brought low by the destruction of the ring. He's still out there. He just can never gain power again because so much of his power was in the ring, and that was destroyed. The ring was destroyed. Sauron is sort of like a pale shadow that can't communicate with the world or change the world or affect the world in any way. To put it in the parlance of a gaming vernacular, he was shunted into spectator mode. But anyway, what happened to the Palantiri after this? Aragorn kept the Orthanc stone. It was his right to do so, and he used it in the way that it was meant to be used, to survey his kingdom and to see things far away. The Ithil stone, that's the one that Sauron had, that was probably lost under the rubble of Barad-dûr because Barad-dûr crumbled, and it may have been destroyed. Now, they never really stated exactly what it would take to actually destroy one of these stones. They were very well made. Now, assuming that the Ithil stone had been destroyed previously led to a lot of problems because we learned that Sauron actually had recovered it. So if the Ithil stone was ever recovered after the War of the Ring, it wasn't mentioned by Tolkien. It's just sitting there under the rubble. Whether it's broken or usable, that's anybody's guess. And finally, the Anor stone. This was the last of the Middle-earth stones that was still around. The Anor stone was the one that Denethor had, and it was actually damaged in Denethor's pyre when he burnt himself alive. And it was said that for the longest time, only the most powerful seers could get any sort of vision out of it. Anybody who looked into it would only see Denethor's flaming, burning hands. So it was damaged in a way, not destroyed, made more difficult to use. And keep in mind that Tolkien's words here were for a long time, meaning that eventually the stone recovered. It wasn't forever. Okay. All right, moving on. Next question. How did the elves of Middle-earth see during the First Age prior to the creation of the sun and the moon? Did it have something to do with their nature, the nature of the stars, or both? The elves had light. They just didn't have daytime. The elves did have starlight. The night sky and the light of the stars was most beloved to them. And it was even mentioned that previous to the awakening of the elves, because the lamps were broken, and because the light of the trees could only reach Middle-earth enough to put it into kind of a twilight, it couldn't really give them daytime, that she added more stars and made the stars brighter, because she knew that they would need lights, they would need signs, they would need constellations. Now, because of this, because of the nature of the way that the elves awoke, they love nighttime, they love the stars, and they would come to love the moon, and they would love the silver tree Telperion above loving daytime and the sun and the golden tree Laurelin. And they did love these things, but the nighttime was more precious to them, more sacred to them. Now, Melkor was able to destroy the lamps, he was able to destroy the trees, and it's even prophesied that one day he may destroy the sun, but he can't destroy the stars. That's one thing that seems to be beyond his capability. Okay, next question, another anonymous one. How did the people of Rohan get food during the siege at Helm's Deep? Okay, so a few things. There was already food there. Theoden mentioned that the Rohirrim had some provisions with them as they traveled there, but Gamling the Old assured him that there were plenty of provisions at the Hornburg at Helm's Deep, that he was the commander of the Hornburg. He was sort of in charge of that whole area. It wasn't left unguarded or unmanned when it wasn't in use. There were men there, and Gamling was their commander. Now, it should also be mentioned that this siege was only like 2 days. It started on March 3rd, it ended on March 4th, so it's not like they went through a lot of provisions in that time. Okay, next question. This one is from Blair Colquhoun, and I guess Blair is a writer and was looking for a little bit of advice on the languages here. So this is the question. If Tolkien had thought of it, would the name Arevendal, meaning Flame of the North, have been a good name for one of the swords in the Legendarium. Now, I spoke to Blair briefly in the comments after this, and she told me that she's a writer and that it's sort of like something for her own project, but she's wondering, would this have fit into something like the Lord of the Rings or the Silmarillion? So my answer to that is, it's not... Arevendal doesn't really mean Flame of the North. That's not really an accurate translation. When you try to mash together words that are in Tolkien's languages into a new name for a sword, we could say derive the proper grammar from Anduril. Anduril means Flame of the North. It was Narsil originally, and it was reforged. And, you know, that name, Anduril, it's Quenya. And Aragorn assures us that this Quenya phrase means Flame of the West. However, when you look up what is the Quenya word for flame, we get Runya. That's what flame is in Quenya. Now, in Sindarin, they would commonly use Anor, but later usage of Anor was the sun. So they would refer to just regular flame as Lak. So the issue arises if you're looking for something like Anduril, a Quenya word, you know, Anduril meaning flame of the west, and you're looking for flame of the north. Well, let's say, what is west in Quenya? We get Numen. So this is interesting because Numen is nowhere in that sword's name. Numenril would be flame of the west, right? But it's not Numenril. It's Anduril. So I'm going to explain this. So Numen is west. That's how we get Westerness, which is man of the west. In Westron, in Quenya, it's Numenore. In Sindarin, Numenor. So when Aragorn refers to Flame of the West, he's referring to not just the west as in the direction, but he's referring specifically to Numenor. Not in the literal sense, otherwise the sword would be Numenril. But the translation comes from the word Endur, which is Quenya, and it means the land of gift. Now, then we get the other part, Ril. That's the suffix. It refers to flame. But now I mentioned, though, that the word for flame is Runya, not Ril. Aragorn is being poetic. The literal meaning of Ril is brilliance, and it usually refers to a sunset, for example. The literal translation of Anduril would be brilliance of the land of gift. Okay. So brilliance, you can see how that leads to flame, a bright light, a burning like a sunset. The land of gift is in the west. So you can see how you get from brilliance of the land of gift to flame of the west. Now, if we understand this, you're looking for flame of the north. Now, you came up with Arevendal. And the best that I could guess is that you're deriving Avaren, meaning north, from Avarenian, which was a region of Beleriand. And we can loosely translate what Avarenian means as land besides the beech trees. The suffix dal actually means end. And it's not actually a Quenya suffix, it's a Sindarin suffix, such as the name Ramdal, which is another land in Beleriand, and it means wall's end. So if we accept all of this, it's not totally proper to refer to any part of Beleriand as really being the north, the same way that it's proper to refer to Numenor as the west. Beleriand was a western land as well. It was northwesterly from the reckoning of Gondor, but still it was the westernmost portion of Middle-earth until it was drowned. Not only this, but Avarenian was actually in the south region. It was one of the southernmost regions of Beleriand. So my opinion here is that in naming a sword after the north, it would make more sense to refer to the north as Arnor, which is a Sindarin word that means Northland. And Quenya, it's Arandor. So if we're equally as poetic as Aragorn is, and it's difficult to be as poetic as Aragorn is, but let's try. Flame of the North would be something like Arandril or Arandoril, depending on which sounds more pleasing to you and which looks more pleasing on the page to you. However, the usage of Ril bothers me, and I'm going to tell you why. It means brilliance, mostly refers to a sunset. Sunsets happen in the west, so you can see the connection there. It seems kind of awkward to say brilliance of the north. Let's be extra poetic and refer to the sword as Aranralmo, Storm of the North. Now that is cool. That's a cool name for a sword. I feel there's some meaning. I feel that it's proper usage of Quenya, and I feel that it's poetic, and it's the sort of poetry that the characters would have. Okay, moving on. Here's the one from the thumbnail, you guys. All right, so it was submitted anonymously, but I like this one. Why would you think Radagast was any less capable than the other wizards that were sent to Middle-earth? I agree he would have been more frightened by the ring wraiths than Gandalf would have been. But Gandalf may have had details of the ring wraiths. So I like this question because Radagast is sort of fascinating because there's not a lot of information about him, and also because it reminds me of a scene from the movie, from the first Hobbit film, when Gandalf mentions Radagast and says, is he a great wizard or is he like you? So, and basically you're asking, is Radagast a great wizard? Can we say that he was a great wizard, or can we say that he wasn't such a great wizard? Now, we don't really know enough about Radagast to make any sort of real assumption about how capable of a wizard he is. But we'll try. Radagast was simply mentioned once in The Hobbit. He was name-dropped by Sauron. Not by Sauron. He was name-dropped by Gandalf when Gandalf was speaking to Bjorn, because he understood that Bjorn had a great respect for Radagast. So he wanted, hey, like, I know him, you know. Gandalf refers to Radagast as a cousin in the early versions of The Hobbit. There was a later revision where he was called a kinsman, and even later, one of my order, he just said. It depends on which printing of the book that you're reading. In The Lord of the Rings, we get a little bit more of Radagast. He was asked by Saruman to find Gandalf and tell him to travel to Isengard. Radagast did not know that this was a trap for Gandalf. He was earnest in this. He thought it was serious. He parked himself near the Shire, and he met Gandalf there on the road, and they had a conversation. And later on, at Gandalf's behest, Radagast sent for news. That's what he was asked to do, to send for news from Isengard. And he requested the eagle, Gwaihir, to scope out the situation, find out what's going on, and that is what led to Gandalf's escape from Orthanc. Radagast is not mentioned after this. We don't really know what became of him. He did not participate in the War of the Ring. He did not return home to the uttermost west. We learn more of his past in the Silmarillion and in the nature of Middle-earth. In the Silmarillion, he was called Eowendil, and in the nature of Middle-earth, he was called Hravendil. So his capabilities are not really known, and they're really supposed to be up to your imagination. I think the only assumptions that we can make are based on the names given to the wizards by the elves and by the men. Gandalf, for example, his real name was Olorin, but he was called Mithrandir, which means Grey Pilgrim, and he was called Gandalf, which means Elf of the Wand. This shows his reputation for being a friend of the elves, for magic, and for wandering. Kuramo was called Saruman, and that is a literal translation of Kuronmo. It means the same exact thing, which is skilled man or cunning man. It's a literal translation. So this tells us he's skillful, he's cunning, and it also tells us that he's less willing to adopt other names given to him by elves and men, or they didn't feel they needed to give him other names. They just called him by his proper name, just in a different language. So there's that. Now the Blue Wizards, they had a few names. Originally they were Alatar and Palando, but they did receive Mannish names. The elves, they did not receive Mannish names, but the elves did give them names. Morenatar means Darkness Slayer, and Romastano means East Helper. There were a few others, but these are the ones I want to focus on, and it shows that one had a reputation for battle, and the other had a reputation for kindness. Now, so then we get to Isildur. We know him as Radagast. Going by these lines, Radagast means tender of beasts, but Tolkien said it meant tender of beasts, but then later on he did say it's not clearly interpretable. Some Tolkien scholars have thought of the word Radagast as being derived from the Old English Radagast, which means spirit of the road, or Radagaisis, which was a Gothic chieftain. Either way, his Mannish name refers to him tending beasts, and in the easiest interpretation at least. And the fact that he got Gwaihir, the Lord of the Eagles, to fly all the way to Isengard, which is far out of his domain, to me, that says it shows a good deal of influence and friendship with beasts. Gwaihir is not exactly at the beck and call of any wizard. Not Gandalf, not Saruman, and certainly not Radagast. So he answers to Manwë. So I would categorize Radagast as a very capable wizard based on that alone. Maybe he was a little bit easily distracted from his purpose. He got too involved with being a hermit. He didn't exactly do what he was sent out to do, and that's why he never returned home, because they would only get the urge to return to Valinor if they fulfilled what they were supposed to do. So that being said, I would say, though, his capabilities, they're high, they're good, because he was able to convince Gwaihir to do something that's sort of not in Gwaihir's nature. And that really shows that he had a good friendship with the Eagles. All right, good question, though. All right, moving on. Next question. Did Sauron physically lose his ability to speak to elves and men after the destruction of Numenor, and his spirit fled back to Middle-earth? Well, Sauron lost his ability to take on a fair form. This doesn't stop him from speaking to elves or to men, but it does greatly hamper his ability to trick them or to fool them. Sauron's ability to shapeshift was his most utilized skill, his most destructive ability. It was his appearance as Anatar that had him fool the elves of Eregion, and that led to the creation of Rings of Power, and I can't tell you how bad that was, you know. It was his form of Tarmairon that led him seduce Pharazon, the king of Numenor, and control Numenor, and it led to Akalabeth, which was an incredibly destructive event. Sauron lost the ability to adopt a fair form, meaning that he cannot have an outward appearance that is beautiful or that radiates goodness. He can still appear terrible, frightening, imposing, and he can speak to anyone he wishes, but he cannot shift into a pleasing or a trustworthy looking form. Okay. All right, next question. I think the music's a little bit loud, especially now that there's like lyrics coming here. So the song's called Elven Winter, by the way. It's from a copyright-free medieval thing that I play. Anyway, here's the next question. And speaking of Pharazon, could our Pharazon have taken over Aman if Iluvatar had not intervened? No, absolutely not. It's important to not just realize that Eru, or Iluvatar, intervened here, but why he did. Iluvatar did not intervene because Aman was helpless. Pharazon and his armada was mighty, but they would be fighting a losing war against an army of elves that cannot die. They would just get shunted into Mandos. And every time one of them is slain, in the event of a war, it's likely that Mandos would have opened up the floodgates. Can you imagine the terror of Pharazon once Feanor descends upon him? Feanor, who fought all the Balrogs? Or Fingolfin, who took on Morgoth himself? Now, this isn't to mention the Ainur. Osei alone could have destroyed the fleet long before they docked. Ianwe could solo the entire Númenórean army by himself, not to mention one armada like that. And then, of course, there's possibly thousands of unnamed Maya out there. And then there's the Valar themselves. Tolkis and Arome could probably just high-five each other, and it would create a sonic boom, a shockwave that would just knock them all off their feet. So this being said, they're all capable of fighting off Pharazon. So why did Iluvatar intervene? It wasn't because Pharazon was a real danger. It was because the Valar were certainly, while they were certainly capable of dealing with any unwanted visitors, they weren't comfortable actually waging war against the children of Iluvatar. They felt that they did not have this authority. So when seeing Pharazon arrive, Manwë prayed to Iluvatar, who hearkened his prayer, and the Akalabeth happened. The Valar probably would have been less destructive, but it wasn't about just Pharazon invading Aman. It was a long history of Númenor losing their faith, worshipping Melkor, enslaving the men of Middle-earth, disrespecting the elves. There was a long list of things that led to this, and this was the final straw. Pharazon decided Sauron was his buddy. He shouldn't have been the king, and literally, he shouldn't have been the king. He took the scepter by force. Númenor was done for at this point. They couldn't be saved. So that's why that happened. Okay, next question. How do elf and human hybrids in The Lord of the Rings work? Elrond and Elros were given a choice. Aragorn was slightly elf. Why didn't he have a choice to be immortal? Okay. So, saying Aragorn is slightly elf is like saying that you might have some of the ancestry from Genghis Khan, right? Under normal circumstances, the product of a human and elf pairing in Tolkien's world is human, mortal. This is why Eärendil was mortal. His father Tuor was mortal at the time, at least. We spoke about this earlier. He did later, become immortal through special grace of Iluvatar, but that was after the fact. Eärendil was born. Tuor was mortal at the time. Similarly, Dior was the son of Beren and Luthien. Now, Luthien was born an elf, but then she died and was reborn as a human. So this really made Dior the product of a human and human. But then he married Nimloth, who was an elf, and that's where Idril came from. I'm sorry, not Idril. I'm screwing it up here. That's where Elwing came from. So Eärendil and Elwing are both mortals with some elvish ancestry. In the case of Elwing, even some Ainur ancestry, because if you go far enough back, there's Melian is in there as well. But they did something that mortals were forbidden to do. I mentioned this earlier. They sailed west, the uttermost west, to pray to Manwë to intercede in the wars of Beleriand. They were successful, but they created a great dilemma. They were mortals who came to Aman, and this was supposed to be a death sentence, as I mentioned earlier. And Mandos reminded Manwë of this, but Manwë was lenient because they both did have elvish ancestry. Being mortals though they were at least part elf. And he wasn't willing to destroy them for coming to Aman, especially that they came there for a very good purpose. So Eärendil and Elwing specifically were forced to choose, were they men or elves? They both chose to be elves. Eärendil actually felt that he wanted to be a man, but he wanted to be with Elwing, so he chose the same as she did. the choice was also visited upon their children, and this is where it gets a little bit more complex. The children were already born. You had Elrond and Elros. Now, they were also, I mentioned Eärendil and Elwing were banned from ever returning to Middle-earth and walking amongst the people, although, as I also mentioned, Eärendil took part in the War of Wrath. So Elrond and Elros, they're already born, but they are told they have to make a choice. Elrond chose to be an elf, and Elros chose to be a man. Now, the complexity comes in here because Elros did not marry an elf. He married a mortal woman. We don't know her name, but he married a mortal woman. So his line was partly elvish, but they weren't subject to this direct choice because Elros's children were born of two mortals. This is also why Elros's line lives so long. They lived longer than even the average Númenorian, but they were mortal, and they were not able to choose immortality, and this goes all the way down to Aragorn. Now, Elrond married an elf, Celebrian, but his children still had the option to become mortal because they had human ancestry. So the deadline for this, it was delayed until such a point as Elrond left Middle-earth. So they were de facto immortals. That's why Elladan, Elrohir, they're over 3,000 years old. Arwen, slightly less than 3,000 years old. But they had to make a choice once Elrond left and sailed west. We don't really know about the sons, but we know that Arwen chose mortality. And since she was marrying a mortal, her son, Eldarion, and all the daughters that she had were also, it was like Elros again. They were not subject to be able to choose immortality, especially the fact that basically, even though they had elvish ancestry, both of their parents were mortal when they were born. And I have to mention as one last thing here that the choice is only subject to the line of Eärendil and Elwing, not to any other marriage of man and elf. Okay. All right, next question. Oh man, I get this one a lot, so let's talk about it. In The Lord of the Rings, Elrond pushes Isildur into the fire of Mount Doom with the ring. Before he gets away, does Elrond face any punishment? Oof. That's all I could say to that. Oof. Okay, so I have to mention, Elrond and Isildur were never anywhere near the fire. The films created the image of Isildur and Elrond going into Samath Naur, with Elrond screaming at Isildur to destroy the ring. Isildur looks quite sinister as he stares directly into the camera and says, "No," and then he walks away. So in the book, that never happened. Their conversation happened outside of Mount Doom. Isildur showed Elrond the ring. Elrond didn't exactly know what to make of it. He knew it was evil, but he didn't quite know exactly what it was. And he said it would be smart to destroy the ring. And he even pointed to Mount Doom as a very likely place to do that. He said, why not cast it into the fire? And Isildur thought about it, and he decided that he would take it as Weirgild for his father, Elendil, and his brother Anarion, who had been slain. So Elrond didn't make any demands, he only gave advice, and Isildur was not sinister or evil. Isildur later came to regret his choice, and part of the reason that he was traveling northwards was to get rid of the ring. He realized that it was evil, it was no good, and he wished to bring it to the elves. One of the last things that was said to Isildur while he was still alive was that he should flee. That even if it appeared dishonorable, he needed to get away and bring the one to the Keepers of the Three. But sadly, he never made it, and the ring had abandoned him. So let's say that the scenario happened the way it did in the movie. Elrond screams, "This is Mordor," or whatever dumb meme you can come up with, and kicks Isildur and the One Ring into the fire, right? Done, right? What happens? Sauron doesn't return, but what about Elrond? He's done something terrible, and Professor Tolkien had a word for it: kinslaying. Elrond would have been no better than Feanor, or Feanor's sons at this point, slaying his own kin, for Isildur was a descendant of his brother Elros, for the greater good. And Tolkien is very clear about this. Doing something evil for a good reason is still evil. Just ask Sauron. Sauron thinks he's just bringing order to Middle-earth. Elrond would have ended Sauron in that scenario, but he would have started a war between elves and men. There would have been a total loss of trust and friendship between the two. The children of Iluvatar would be forever pit against each other with no hope of reconciliation. And that's a big if. If Elrond was able to do this, the more likely scenario is Isildur fights back. They wrestle. Finally, Elrond wins. He gets Isildur into the fire, and then he looks down and he just notices that the ring is in his hand. Well, he could throw it in, right? Can he? Why not keep it? That's how seductive the ring is. That's how tricky the ring is. No one could willingly destroy it in that fashion. It didn't work that way. In The Lord of the Rings, Frodo couldn't even cast it into the fire in his home. He told Gandalf, I want to destroy it. I want to see it destroyed. And Gandalf said, well, okay, throw it in that fire right there. Now, Gandalf had already thrown the ring into that fire, and it was unharmed. It wasn't even warmed up by the fire. All it did was light up the Tengwar script on it. So Frodo knew that his fire couldn't even come close to damaging the ring, but he wasn't able to chuck it in. The ring had him. That's how the ring works. And if Elrond took it by force like that, he would have been corrupted instantly. The same way Gollum was, because Gollum murdered to get the ring. Okay. Next question. This is a quick one, and this was requested by Andy J. Crom, who asks, if Aragorn's lineage can be traced directly back to Isildur, then why did the rule of kings in Gondor end when Iarnur disappeared? Shouldn't the kingship simply have been passed to whatever living ancestor Aragorn had at the time of Iarnur's demise? Good question. And it would have if the laws of Gondor were like the laws of Numenor. But there's a few issues that prevented that from happening. Firstly, and I have to mention this, Isildur was not the king of Gondor. He was the king of Arnor. His brother Anarion was the king of Gondor. Being descended from Isildur alone would not make somebody a king of Gondor. Aragorn was descended from both of them. He was descended from Isildur and he was descended from Anarion, because Isildur had a descendant named Arvedui, and Anarion had a descendant named Firiel, and Arvedui and Firiel married each other. You can say, well, they were kind of related, but they were so far apart, like something like fifth cousins a million times removed or something. Well, not a million, but you get what I'm saying. I'm using a little hyperbole here. They weren't really all that closely related. So that is the line that leads to Aragorn, is Arvedui and Firiel. So yes, you can trace him back to Isildur, but that doesn't have much to do with Gondor. Now you might ask, well, you could trace him back to Anarion. So why isn't Anarion's line the king of Gondor? Because Iarnur was Anarion's heir, and he had no heirs. The problem was he had no male heirs. Gondor is agnatic, and that means that they only recognized heirs descended from the male line, that's why Arvedui was denied kingship. That's why Firiel was not the queen of Gondor, the ruling queen. Right? Aragorn's claim came from not just his bloodline, but from all the prophecies that he fulfilled, all the things that he did that was said that only the true king could do. It was more than just the bloodline. Denethor was aware of Aragorn. He was aware of him even when he came to Gondor in his youth, calling himself Thorongil. He guessed who he was, and that he was in league with Mithrandir, that's Gandalf, and it was likely that Denethor came by this knowledge by use of his Palantiri. But he even said he is an heir of Anarions only through the female line, and being Isildur's heir does not make you king of Gondor. So, if Denethor had lived, it's very likely that he would have rejected Aragorn's claim. But Denethor didn't live. The next ruling steward was his son Faramir, and Faramir recognized him as king. So that's why he became king. Because the steward was willing to say, this man is the king, he should be the king, he's fulfilling all sorts of prophecies, he won the War of the Ring, he has the healing hands, he came bearing the reforged sword. There's so many others. There's a lot of prophecies that the paths of the dead and everything else that Aragorn did. And he had so many different endorsements from Rohan, from Lorien, from Rivendell, from the Ainur, from the planet itself. So that's all what led to the return of the king. They weren't looking just for somebody who was related to Anarion or related to Isildur, because they knew the bloodlines, they knew who the heirs were, but they didn't recognize women as queens, even though they did that in Numenor because of Tar Aldarion's laws. But Gondor and Numenor were not the same thing. All right, so this next question was submitted by Rosa Loves Frodo. Interesting name, especially considering what the question is. So here's the question. I'd recently spoke with this person online who pretends they're Frodo Baggins. They say that as Frodo, of course, at Cirith Ungol, the orcs beat and stabbed him. Did Frodo really get that much torture? Frodo was definitely not stabbed at Cirith Ungol. Frodo was unconscious for most of this. The orcs were under orders to not really do anything too damaging to any hobbit prisoners. Frodo was stripped down, and at one point he was whipped, but Sam came to his rescue. Your friend, son's worrying. It's a little bit worrying that they're pretending to be Frodo. I understand the whole roleplay thing, but especially after some of the comments that were made, I would tell your friend that, well, I guess you know that your friend needs some help, because we did speak on Quora, and you did say that, there's a bug. Mosquito. Did I get him? I snatched at him, and he went down, but then he was fluttering around on my desk, and I don't see him now. It was a mosquito. I hate mosquitoes, but well, anyway, that's all I have to say on that. I did find it slightly concerning, but we did already speak about that, so I don't have to go over it here. Okay. All right, next question. Is it possible that Manwë could have sought the permission of Eru to grant immortality to Tuor, since the Silmarillion explains that he was accounted amongst them when him and Idril arrived in Valinor? Yeah, I mean, we kind of talked about Tuor already a little bit, so there's not much to say here. It was by the grace of Iluvatar that Tuor became counted amongst the Eldar. Tuor was an unusual case. He was considered elf fair. He donned elvish raiment, he had elvish armor, he had elvish weapons that was left for him, it was meant for him. He communed with Ulmo. He lived in Gondolin and was friends with King Turgon. He married an elf. He also had the sea longing, and this is the biggest thing to me. He had the sea longing. That is something that's only supposed to happen to elves. Only an elf would experience the sea longing. So, I'm sorry, there is a flying bug around here, and I just saw it go by. Alright, I didn't get it. I'll have to try to get it after we finish. We're almost done here. Anyway, Iluvatar made him an elf. And with all these things, the way that he looked like an elf, he dressed like an elf, he lived like an elf, he married an elf, and he had the sea longing like an elf. It's almost like he was born the wrong way, that he was born Edan of the Edain, but that he was meant to be an elf. So Iluvatar makes him an elf. Tolkien himself stated that this was a special grace. The Valar didn't have the authority to do that. They didn't have the power to do that. They didn't have the power to grant him immortality or anyone else immortality. Now, some people have speculated, and I'm fond of this theory, that Ulmo had great foresight. And it wasn't just the fact that he called Tuor to the sea and communed with him simply to send him to Gondolin and pass on a message to Turgon. Ulmo could have done that himself. He could have sent Ose. He could have sent an elf. Why did he choose a man to do this? And it was of Tuor and Idril that Arevendal was born, and Arevendal sailed west. And we talked about this twice now. He was the one that convinced Manwë and the rest of the Valar that they needed to intervene, and that led to the War of Wrath and Morgoth's downfall. And that could have been just because Ulmo chose a man, and that might have been why Ulmo chose a man in that sense. And that it might have been why he had the sea longing. It might have been he was always meant to be an elf. Okay, next question. Let's see. Was Sauron actually evil or just corrupted by Melkor? If the Valar helped him, could he have repented? He was indeed evil, though not at his creation, nor was Melkor. Elrond said, and it's true, nothing is evil in the beginning. Sauron was indeed corrupted by Melkor, but this doesn't make him not evil. A great many others resisted the corruption of Melkor. Sauron embraced it, even long after Melkor was gone from the world. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien states that Melkor was only more evil than Sauron by virtue of being the boss. Sauron initially was his servant. Later, he took up the mantle of the Dark Lord for himself after Melkor had gone. Could he repent? Absolutely. He could have, and he specifically chose not to. He did sue for pardon after the War of Wrath, stating, "I'm only following orders." You know, that never works, but he tried it. Ianwe told him that he didn't have the authority to give pardon to Sauron. He would have to travel to Valinor and throw himself at the mercy of the Valar. In the end, whatever punishment or whatever terms of pardon would be decided by Manwë. Sauron was told this, and he didn't do it. He didn't do it. Instead, he tried to curry favor with the Valar by doing good works, by healing Middle-earth. Eventually, he lapsed into his evil ways again. He didn't like the results that he was getting. He didn't see the Valar approving of what he was doing. He figured they had lost interest in Middle-earth, and it was up to him to save it by imposing order. So if Sauron really truly wanted to repent, he knew what he had to do. He could have done it right then. He could have traveled to Valinor. He could have thrown himself at Manwë's feet and repented. And he would have been punished, I think. He probably would have been locked in Mandos for several ages, just as Melkor once was. But he was fearful, and he was prideful, and he didn't do it. Okay, last question. In Tolkien's works, would all swords crafted by elves glow blue when orcs are near, or just the ones from Gondolin, or is it just specific swords from Gondolin? It is indeed just specific swords from Gondolin that would do that, the blue glow. That's actually the elvish hatred of goblins or orcs that is put into the blade. It glows like a blue flame whenever their ancient enemy is nearby. The blades were created specifically in what Elrond referred to as the Goblin Wars, or the Wars of Beleriand against the forces of Morgoth and Sauron. The fall of Gondolin was what that eventually led to. Orcrist, which means Goblin Cleaver, was an important sword. It was likely used by a very important elf, such as maybe Ecthelion. Glamdring, which means Foe Hammer, was actually used by the King of Gondolin himself, Turgon. Sting was a less important weapon. The name was actually given to it by Bilbo. It didn't have a name before that, but it was likely a dagger that was a companion to another Gondolin sword. Some people have surmised that it could have been the dagger used by Glorfindel to slay a Balrog. I doubt that personally. That one fell into an abyss, and it was lost in Beleriand. While someone may have eluded those swords from, they might have looked for the swords or found the swords in the ruin of Gondolin, likely Morgoth's forces, evil, and that's why, eventually wound up in a troll horde in Eriador. But I don't think anybody climbed into that chasm looking for Glorfindel's dagger, because they would have had to take it out of there. That was in Beleriand, so that's long gone. That's under the waves. So that being said, these swords were of special make and were used by very important elves. Not every sword in Gondolin had these properties, and it was only in Gondolin that swords like that were made. Anyway, that is the final question, so that is it for this week, guys. Thank you for your continued support. Leave me some comments, give me a like, subscribe if you haven't. We'll see you guys next week.